this is Demetria Spinrad.
And this is Isaac Meyer.
And you're listening to Criminal Records Podcast, a podcast about some of the weirdest cases in true crime history. And this is going to be a bit of a jet-lagged episode because I got a pretty amazing chance to take a bit of a last-minute trip to England for a new job. And I actually got to stay on the estate, not in the building because it's since been torn down, but on the estate where James I died and where Charles I was proclaimed king.
And does that fill you with the love and fondness for the English monarchy?
I would say, as monarchs go, maybe not the most auspicious pair, but it was really wonderful. It was a delightful experience. Got to see some, actually, the building that is standing there does have its own very intriguing history as well. And let's just say a little item that was banned by the 1938 Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act might have happened to find its way back to America somehow.
I mean, I can't endorse this flagrant lawbreaking as a man of firm conviction who believes, of course, in the absolute morality of the law.
Well, Isaac, I might farm this for content. I might make you eat your first Kinder Egg ever on camera.
Oh, nobody tell Joe Biden. He'll be so disappointed in me.
But today, because I've had kind of a crazy couple weeks, instead of doing a specific case, I wanted to flip the script a little bit and talk about a method of investigating crimes, which I was thinking about because on the flight on the way over, I was listening to some true crime podcasts, as I often do. And something that was really bugging me was the host was making a big deal out of a suspect refusing to take a polygraph test. If you listen to true crime podcasts, you've probably heard someone making a big deal out of that at some point in time. I'm not going to call out the specific person because I otherwise like their podcast. This is just something that I feel that they're a bit misinformed about.
I thought the whole point of being an internet personality was to start internet drama. That's why I'm trying constantly to start beef with the Japanese monarchy.
Let's see how that goes for you.
I mean, I think I could take Naruhito. He's not that tall.
Well, the thing about true crime podcaster beef is that most of us have no formal training in any subject related to criminal justice. I know, shocking. They just let anyone pick up a microphone these days and start podcasting, even medieval studies majors.
It's ridiculous, honestly. They'll just let anyone on the internet these days.
So even if you do have some background in criminal justice, you might not have been exposed to much of the technical background of what polygraph tests, which are sometimes and somewhat mistakenly referred to by the public as lie detector tests, are actually doing. Because, spoiler alert, they are not magical lie detecting machines. But the public's belief that the police have a magical lie detecting machine, I'm just going to say maybe that's not doing great things to our ability to actually catch and convict criminals. And I think the public might be a little bit misinformed about when and where polygraph tests are used and what they're used for.
All right, well, take me through this. Yeah, I'm curious. I know a little bit about the basic idea of a polygraph being to, like, check people's stress levels. And it makes a certain amount of intuitive sense, right? We are often, I imagine, stressed out when we are lying, right? And we know we are lying. So it makes sense he'd be able to see that someone is stressed out and then kind of draw a conclusion that they are more or less likely to be telling the truth. But I imagine that's more challenging to actually determine than in the kind of cut and dried summary I just gave.
Well, sir, I'm going to take you way back before the concept of a stress level was even a thing. I'm going all the way back. We're going really far back in history to talk about this. I wanted to get philosophical for a second with you. Would you say that from a certain angle, an ethical justice system is supposed to be first and foremost about revealing the truth of what happened?
That's a good question. My immediate inclination is to say yes, simply because we assign truth a lot of moral value, and the kind of core of any functional system has to be getting people to believe in it. So therefore, if a system is thought to be more or less revealing of the truth, it seems like people would be correspondingly more or less willing to believe in the conclusions of that system, which is what makes the system work.
All right, so we're in agreement here. Truth, getting to what is true, is going to be an important part of an investigation of any crime. But in the real world, things get messy. Criminals lie to conceal their crimes, and suspects who didn't commit the crime you're investigating might be lying as well because they're trying to conceal a minor unrelated crime. Often people make mistakes while they are telling a true story, or they behave in ways that are so suspicious that investigators would come to the conclusion that they're lying, even though they're actually telling the truth. It is possible, and actually surprisingly frequent in some situations, for people to crack under pressure and confess to crimes they didn't commit. So witnesses might lie on purpose or make mistakes because human memory can be faulty, especially when it comes to recognizing names and faces. So every justice system on Earth that's even a little bit interested in being a system of justice instead of a way to send your enemies to the gulags has to come up with some kind of method for sorting out lies from truth. So I wanted to weigh the pros and cons of some of the methods of lie detection that have been tried throughout history, and then we'll work our way up to the modern polygraph test.
Sounds good. I'm a big fan personally of ritual sacrifice. I think that's a classic. Read the entrails, see what they tell you. You can't go wrong with that.
I like where your head's at right now because number one on my list is divine intervention. Let's start with the pros of divine intervention. And for the purposes of examining the pros, we are going to approach this from the assumption that you are part of a culture that sincerely believes that your god, spirits, God, or other divine forces of your choosing are real. And that belief is pervasive enough that your legal code is written with that metaphysical understanding of the world in mind. So, if you are a part of a culture that believes in a divinity or spiritual presence that is real, omnipotent, or at least reasonably up to date about what's happening on the material plane, and capable of intervening on that material plane, it actually makes a lot of sense to ask for some supernatural help with lie detection. That seems like something that God should be able to step in and help you handle.
With you so far, yeah, makes sense.
But there are some obvious cons. Obviously, what if your culture's wrong and God or the specific God that you're asking for help isn't real? Pretty big potential downside. Number two, what if God is real, but whatever priest or spirit medium interpreting the will of God has an incentive to edit the divine message they're receiving?
Yeah, and that can be challenging too, because I think Zone of Truth is a second level divine spell, and you need a level 4 cleric, I think, to grab that. So you can't just find those anywhere.
Sir, you have played so much Baldur's Gate. I'm loving where your head's at right now.
I don't think that one's in Baldur's Gate, but it is a classic Dungeons and Dragons trick. Shout out to all the people who thought that was funny, and the rest of you, I don't know, you need to play more tabletop games.
All right. Well, if you are in the real world and not in Dungeons and Dragons, another possible complication. What if God might or might not be real, but the process of religious channeling of God's will involves interpretation of unclear vision or omens that are essentially a coin toss. So even if your priests are not incentivized to edit the messages they're receiving, what if the messages they receive are somewhat confusing? What if God is real, but God's capricious and is not necessarily interested in an impartial outcome in your court of law? That is something that some cultures have had to deal with. What if God is real, but asking for divine intervention to solve problems is less important than developing a logical system of argumentation on Earth? If you are Jewish and familiar with some Talmudic stories, you might have heard of that one.
Yeah, that's a really fun one because there are points in the Talmud where divine intervention to discover the truth is literally rejected in favor of more traditional debate mechanisms.
Yes, so just because a culture does more or less universally believe in an omnipotent God doesn't mean that they are necessarily going to write that God into their legal code. And then, of course, what if you're conquered or proselytized to by a different religion with different gods? Do you have to rewrite your whole legal code around your new religion? What if you're a member of a minority religion in a culture with different beliefs about how God operates? And finally, and this is what's going to be particularly interesting for our divine intervention method of receiving the truth. What if God might or might not be real, but everyone's collective belief that God is real makes the system work out fairly well for your purposes anyway?
I know exactly where you're planning on going based on that.
Oh, yes. This brings us to the kind of lie detector test I wanted to talk about first: trial by ordeal. So, this is the kind of trial that's usually associated with people grabbing red hot pokers or throwing witches in water. You probably associate that with Western late medieval Europe, and I would say you're incorrect to do so. A whole lot of cultures more or less independently worked through the same basic logic, which is if there's a divine presence that we're already asking to intervene to do things like protect ourselves from injuries and grant us victories, why don't we go ahead and have our suspected criminals do something that should injure them? And then if they don't get injured, that is proof that the divine presence intervened to show us that the suspect is innocent.
Makes sense so far.
So in ancient Japan, there was a procedure called, I'm going to absolutely butcher the Japanese here, kugatachi. The suspect would swear an oath to the kami, then stick their hand in boiling water or mud. An innocent suspect would pull their hand out unburnt, while a guilty one would be injured. In ancient Iran, there was a version of this trial that was a lot more metal, and I mean literally metal, as in having molten metal poured on your bare breast. There were actually over 30 tests involving fire in that culture. Fire is venerated in Zoroastrian cultures, as it is to some degree in a whole lot of cultures around the world, which is why you're going to see a whole lot of trials by fire specifically. Which isn't to say that every trial by ordeal in ancient Iran was quite that hardcore. You could take a trial by ordeal by swearing an oath and then drinking a potion that had sulfur in it. The idea here is that sulfur is an element associated with fire, so if you lie, it's going to burn your insides. We know today that sulfur is a common element in drinking water. At high concentrations, it has a mild laxative effect. So...
Wait. So they're trying to figure out if you're literally full of shit.
So best case, your ordeal is drinking some water that smells like farts and then having kind of an unpleasant bathroom situation. Worst case is having molten metal poured on your chest.
One of those does sound preferable, I have to say.
Well, if fire is not really your speed, you could also go with trial by combat. That is another kind of ordeal where you or the champion of your choice fights sometimes, but not always to the death, on the assumption that the gods are going to intervene to make sure that the right guy wins. Caesar and Tacitus wrote about the Germanic tribes they encountered settling legal disputes with 1v1 sword duels. And they made sure to note that down because the ancient Romans were surely above that sort of barbarism. Of course, their gods were believed to be pretty actively involved on the material plane too, but the Roman Republic actually had a very complicated relationship with magic and mysticism, so even though they did have their own civic religion, they also had a history of trying to keep shady magicians like astrologers away from influencing their court systems.
Yeah, you just want morally upright forms of augury, like reading chicken guts, like adults do.
So, some elements of the Roman legal code were hugely influential on later European codes of law, but many cultures in medieval Europe did go through phases of using trial by ordeal to settle criminal and sometimes civil legal disputes. Some of these were painful but not injurious challenges, like the ordeal of the cross, where whoever could hold a crucifixion T-pose long enough without support won.
You literally T-posing to assert your superiority.
I think you made exactly that joke the last time I brought that up in our
Yeah, I
last
mean,
duel
it's
episode.
it's a great joke. I don't know what you're talking about. You got to recycle material sometimes, you know?
So Salic law, which was an ancient Frankish legal code, was very big on trial by ordeal. And that legal system was very influential in a big chunk of Europe because the Franks conquered quite a bit of Europe and then got mixed in with some other groups. So when groups like the Normans went on to conquer new territory, they happened to spread the remnants of that Salic law into new territories as well. Salic law used something called the kettle ordeal, or the trial by cauldron, which worked the same way as that ancient Japanese trial that I discussed, with the suspect's hand going into a pot of boiling water. But this wasn't the only type of trial by ordeal in medieval Europe. In the same way that Zoroastrians believed fire wouldn't burn a pure person, some medieval European cultures believed that water would reject an impure person. So just toss your suspect in a pond. The floaters are guilty. The sinkers are innocent. Of course, you got to make sure to tie a rope around your suspect first so that you don't drown the guy that you just proved to be innocent. A lot of stuff. I know that witch trials kind of picked up steam post-medieval era, but the whole thing about throwing the witch in the pond to see if she floats or sinks, that's coming out of this understanding of how water works.
I thought you just check if they turn you into a newt.
Classic jokes.
Yeah, referential humor. It's the highest form of comedy.
And of course, there were a whole lot of variants on the theme of seeing if fire or hot objects burned a suspect through trials like carrying a hot iron a certain distance or walking over heated plowshares. So, to modern listeners, this is probably going to sound like superstitious nonsense. Even historically, a lot of people thought this was superstitious nonsense. There's a reason that trial by ordeal was not the entirety of a legal investigation in most cases. There are actually a few cultures around the world who still practice trial by ordeal to this day, but in Western Europe, the Catholic Church squashed the practice with the Fourth Lateran Council in 1215. And there's a reason that the trial of Jacques Legris, which we covered in an earlier episode, was made into a movie called The Last Duel, because it was the last judicial duel in that area and one of the last in Europe. If you've listened to that episode, you'll know that even getting permission for trial by combat required the accuser to work his way up through a whole lot of other legal wrangling. He wasn't just allowed to go fight a guy because God said he should. It turns out that when you have an organized church and state, those organizations tend to prefer having some formal legal procedures instead of randomly burning suspects with hot irons.
Well, one imagines it makes things a little challenging when you're trying to run a government if all of your senior leadership are constantly, like, challenging each other to duels to prove who's right and who's wrong. That makes getting your taxes very challenging.
Yeah, talk about a government shutdown.
Okay, A plus, well played. Golf clap.
So, does this mean that our divine intervention option never worked as a lie detector test? Here's the weird thing. A recent wave of interest in the psychology and science behind trial by ordeal suggests that maybe, under some very specific circumstances, it could be a useful legal tool for some cultures. Because here's the twist. Before you undergo your ordeal, you have to swear to your God, who you sincerely believe in, that you are telling the truth. And if confession is a part of your religious practice, you may have to confess the truth to the very same priest who is administering your trial. Fear of undergoing the ordeal, being harmed, and thus being exposed as a liar could be enough to get a confession out of a suspect who is really guilty. So this could be enough to be what makes them crack and stop lying. And on the other hand, if a suspect is innocent, he has just told the unfiltered truth to the priest who is about to control the trial. So the temperature of the water he's going to stick his hand in, or the iron that he's going to be exposed to, The person who gets to put his thumb on the scales of how this trial goes is the person who knows the truth because he has just heard this person's confession. Even some of the really hardcore trials I just talked about can be fudged in theory. Remember that trial with the molten metal?
Mm-hmm.
It is actually possible to pour molten metal on your skin and not burn. There is something called the Leidenfrost effect. So you can actually very briefly come in contact with molten metal or hot oil under very specific conditions. Don't recommend you do that, but it is technically possible to do so. So maybe trial by ordeal could work under some circumstances in some cultures, not necessarily because we know for sure that God is getting involved, but it's a bit of a mind game with kind of a cool magic trick component to it.
So the idea here is simply that the whole thing is premised on the psychology of belief and sort of the fear of being found out.
Yes. If everyone involved believes that this test works to the point that the criminal believes that it works and is going to behave differently during the confession and the oath swearing portion, maybe it works.
Okay, makes sense.
So that's option number one, getting the divine to handle your lie detection for you. If that doesn't work, how about option number two, torture?
I mean, always a classic.
Look, there is no need to get God involved in your legal system when, with a little hard work and gumption, you can torture a confession out of somebody.
I mean, that runs into the classic problem that torture always runs into, which is that you never can trust the confession completely.
A lot of cultures did not recognize that that is a common problem with torture, and they went through a whole lot of a torture phase. There are a lot of ways to cause immense amounts of pain to the human body. I'm not going to list every single method of torture in human history here. Human ingenuity has produced an extraordinary number of ways for people to hurt other people.
What a testament to the human spirit.
And if you've listened to this podcast for a while, you will know torture comes up a lot because we talk about historical true crime. And throughout a lot of history, torture was both a method of determining who needed to be punished and the method of punishment itself. So you could be tortured as part of an investigation before your trial, or you could be tortured as a sentence. But like you said, obvious problem, torture's not really very effective at lie detection. If anything, it's pretty good at lie creation. People will lie under the threat of torture if they think it's going to make the pain stop. Some methods of torture are not physical, and the falsehoods they produce might not even be obvious to the person who is lying, like sleep deprivation. If you keep a suspect awake long enough, you can put them in such a suggestible state that they may end up creating false memories of the crime that you're accusing them of. And so you may get a confession, a very sincere confession on the suspect's part. They really believe that they did this, even though they didn't. So you're just creating the opportunity for more falsehoods to enter the record.
As surprising no one, the systems I'm most familiar with are Imperial China and like pre-Meiji Restoration Japan when it comes to this. And both of those places, by the kind of latter years of that pre-modern judicial system, there was substantial suspicion of kind of confessions extracted in this way for exactly this reason, which was not the same, like, those techniques were never banned. Just eventually it became practice not to rely primarily on information attained that way and to only use it as corroboration because of the kind of concerns around accuracy.
Yes, that is the thing about torture. If the goal of your legal system is to get confessions out of people, torture is phenomenally good at that. If the goal of your legal system is to figure out the truth of what happened, torture is not so good at that because you are going to get a lot of false positives on your confessions. And of course, if you want to get ethical with it, is any risk of torturing a potentially innocent person an acceptable risk in your legal system?
I mean, are you asking me my opinion of that?
Yeah, we're trying to build the best possible lie detection into our legal system here.
I would say that as much as I hate to admit this about myself, I sympathize enough with the ideas of Immanuel Kant that I am opposed to torturing people.
Oh man, I didn't even have to torture that confession out of you.
I mean, it's torture to admit it, honestly, that pretentious German dick.
So I think we're going to take a pretty bold stance on this podcast. Torture isn't good.
Yeah, don't torture people. That's extremely unchill, and the vibes are very negative.
Yeah, it's not good as a lie detection tool, and it's just not a good thing to do to people, whatever those people might or might not have done. Controversial, I know. We're really going out on a limb with this one. So let's go ahead and cross torture off our list of lie detector tests. But we've removed divine intervention and we've removed torture.
Well, we've tried nothing. I'm out of ideas.
Well, I've got a new idea for you. Let's go with option number 3, drugging your suspect so that they cannot tell a lie.
Ah, yes, truth serums. I'm curious about this one. I certainly know it is possible to mess with people by drugging them pretty substantially and lowering inhibitions. I can think of plenty of substances, some of which are not even hard to administer to people, that make their inhibitions go down.
You have noticed something that a lot of people throughout history have noticed, that in vino there is sometimes veritas. Various cultures throughout history that had access to alcohol would occasionally try to get their crime suspects drunk before confession. It will not surprise you to learn this technique was not working super well for them. I couldn't find any instances of anyone really writing "get your suspect really drunk so they'll confess" into a legal code, because it's very clearly not an effective method of interrogation.
But it is an effective method of partying.
One could make an argument, I guess, that swearing an oath that you're telling the truth could be an attempt at creating a kind of supernatural truth-telling environment. So sort of using God as your serum if everyone believes in it. But the reason that so many cultures resorted to trial by ordeal was because just having your suspects swear an oath was not working out very well on the truthiness front. There needed to be an extra element in the trial to determine whether or not their oath was true or not. So the first legal case I could find involving drugging someone to get a confession out of them in a way that then that evidence that was revealed in an intoxicated state ends up being taken to court. The first case I could find of that happened in 1903. A police officer confessed that he had murdered his wife under the influence of ether.
Ether? Okay, so that's one of them old-timey words, but I don't actually know what that is scientifically.
That is a substance that was used as a very early anesthetic, also actually sometimes a cocktail ingredient. Unfortunately, it's extremely flammable. So after some incidents involving people catching on fire, it kind of went out of fashion as an anesthetic.
I can't imagine why. It could add a little excitement to the whole process.
But interest in truth serums really picked up in the 1920s when a man named Dr. Robert House began to experiment with a drug called scopolamine. You may have heard of that. That is the twilight sleep drug, which I think does still have some uses as an anesthetic today. I don't get the impression that it's quite as much fun to consume as ether.
I'm familiar with twilight sleep. I didn't realize it also made you truthy.
Doesn't make you particularly truthy. It does put you in this weird state where you are sort of awake and can talk, but it messes with your ability to remember things. It didn't work out very well as a truth drug in the end. But the 1940s produced quite a lot of interest in psychiatric drugs because both sides in World War II were dosing up their own soldiers, and of course the Nazis were also performing a lot of horrifying experiments on their victims. So, a couple of different schools of thought developed during this time. One school of thought is that sedatives like barbiturates would make a suspect so relaxed that he would automatically tell the truth. So the idea here is that people have to be a certain level of stressed out to lie, and if you prevent them from developing any kind of stress, they just won't realize that there's any negative consequence to telling the truth and revealing the secret. So that's one school of thought. Another school of thought is that hallucinogens like mescaline are going
Yeah,
to
there we go.
yeah, there we go. They're going to remove a person's willpower and thus take away their ability to lie. So they're going to tell the truth because the interrogator is able to overwhelm their willpower, and willpower is what is allowing someone to maintain a false story.
Now, am I remembering right that the CIA in particular tried this with LSD during the whole MK Ultra thing?
You're remembering that very correctly.
Man, the Cold War was weird.
Both America and the USSR got very into the idea of finding truth serums. Two superpowers that are constantly spying on each other have a pretty strong incentive to figure out ways if their own agents or agents captured from the other side are telling the full story. So the Soviets had top secret labs in which they made use of a substance called SP-117. And that was supposed to be a truth serum. And for years, it was rumored that the Soviet Union had this incredibly powerful truth serum at its disposal. However, after the fall of the USSR, it was leaked that while a substance called SP-117 was real, it was actually just highly concentrated alcohol. So Soviet spies were just going around getting people incredibly drunk.
There's a very insensitive Russian joke in there somewhere.
But fear that the Soviets had cracked the secret of erasing a person's willpower spurred military researchers in the US to try to search for the same scientific breakthroughs. And this is where the CIA's Project MK Ultra comes in. This was a series of extremely ethically dubious experiments in mind control and erasing the will of subjects. Part of what makes them so ethically dubious is that many of the subjects of these experiments did not know what they were volunteering for if they had the option of volunteering at all, and were not, for instance, prisoners of the state who got dosed with massive quantities of LSD.
Why, I'm not a lawyer, but I feel like there's one or two things in the Constitution about just taking people and pumping them full of drugs against their will.
I don't recall anything in the Constitution saying don't feed your prisoners massive amounts of LSD. I don't think the founding fathers really thought that one was going to be an option.
I was thinking more the cruel and unusual punishment bit.
I would say, yeah, it has very much been argued that section of the Constitution should have covered a lot of what went on in the MK Ultra experiments.
Even if you're not going to argue the cruel end of it, I don't know how you could argue with a straight face that it's not at least unusual.
So here's the problem with truth serums. Like torture, and I would definitely say many of these attempts to produce truth serums were themselves a form of torture. They don't actually work at preventing lies, and they may further impede your suspect's ability to tell the truth. It turns out that getting people really, really, really zooted is not a very reliable method of interrogation. So getting a bunch of people high to counter the secret Soviet technique of getting a bunch of people drunk did not actually end up unlocking the secrets of mind-controlling suspects to tell the truth.
I'm shocked, I tell you.
So finally, we're going to move on to option number 4, physiological monitoring. So here's the logic behind this method of lie detection. When someone lies, they may be pretty good at acting. They may be able to look and sound convincingly that they are telling the truth, but something is happening unconsciously without their control inside their body that is going to give that lie away. So if you can measure whatever that unconscious signal is, you can tell if someone's lying. And this goes back a lot further than you might think. Plenty of ancient cultures noticed that when someone's under stress, things start happening in their body that they can't control. As early as 1000 BCE, Chinese legal interrogations sometimes involved the suspect or the person who was being interrogated holding rice in their mouth and then spitting it out for examination. A liar's rice would be dry, while if someone was telling the truth, their rice would be sticky. There's also a version of this from ancient India. I found some sources saying that the test was measuring whether the suspect could spit out the rice or if it was too sticky. Others claim that the suspect was supposed to chew the dry rice until their gums bled. And if the rice is so dry that it's cutting up your mouth, that's a sign that you're guilty. Either way here, the idea is that a fearful person is going to experience a dry mouth, while a person who has nothing to fear will salivate normally.
I mean, okay, that I don't know that I'm all on board the shoving rice into people's mouths train, but I can see the logic.
Yeah, basically you can see the logic. There are a lot of other things that can affect salivation, though. One thing I wasn't actually sure whether or not to sort into this category, there is an early Christian version of this test involving someone choking or cleanly swallowing the consecrated host. That to me was kind of riding the line between the God says you're lying option and the can't produce enough saliva option. It is true that acute stress can reduce salivation. I do want to point out that in some people, anxiety and depression can also increase salivation. This just doesn't seem like a very accurate test to me. It seems like there's a lot of other things that affect your levels of salivation.
I don't know what you mean. I think it seems totally normal.
So that is the saliva option. But what about your heart?
What about my heart?
So the Greek scientist Erasistratus sometimes gets credited with inventing the pulse-based method of lie detection in the 2nd century BCE. I will say though, in the story about this, he was noticing a heart rate increase that was happening when a guy heard the name of a woman that he had the hots for, not when he deliberately told a lie. So he does notice that people's heart rate goes up when they are experiencing strong emotion. And it does happen in a situation where he is trying to determine if someone is lying, but I'm not really sure if that would be considered lie detection specifically.
It's also, I mean, legally a bit challenging to be unable to determine the difference between I am lying and I am horny.
I mean, it was ancient Greece. Was there a difference?
I guess, I mean, in a place where everyone's always horny.
The Persian physician Avicenna devoted a whole lot of time to studying the human pulse in the 12th century, and he noticed that strong emotions can cause the pulse to speed up. Unsurprising. Seems like most people who have a human body have figured that one out. We have some other medieval stories about people doing things like detecting adultery by checking a person's pulse, although again, people seem to understand it was the strength of emotion that was causing the heart to beat faster, not necessarily whether they were lying or telling the truth. As science developed more standardized ways of measuring a person's pulse and blood pressure, researchers started getting interested in using this new technology for lie detection. Criminologists in the 1800s did dabble in testing some physiological signs like the pulse or sweating to suss out lies. But what we know today as the lie detector test comes from the early 1900s. So Isaac, I gotta ask you, have you ever heard of a man named William Moulton Marston?
I can't say that I have, no.
Well, I know you have because you watched a whole movie about his polyamorous relationship drama.
Oh, wait. Wait.
This is the creator of Wonder Woman.
Yeah, what the ever-loving... I mean, Wonder Woman, one of the great classic comics. Big fan, I'd say. What does that have to do with any of this? I know she has a magic lasso that makes people tell the truth.
It is true that she does have that magic lasso, and a lot of people kind of mistakenly attribute the golden truth-telling lasso to Marston's work in lie detection. But this is actually, okay, this is where it gets complicated. He wasn't necessarily specifically trying to come up with a lie detector. What he was doing was studying human psychology. So what he was actually particularly interested in was human emotion. The golden lasso itself was not intended to be a lie detector test. It was kind of a sexist, very horn dog statement about feminine charm being something that could control men. Also, of course, because Marston was the way he was, an excuse to draw lots of men and women submitting to and kneeling at the feet of powerful Amazonians.
Okay, hold on. Just back up a spell here, just to make sure we're all on the same page. So we have this psych professor who is on the one hand doing research into, I guess, like the idea of like extreme human emotion, and also at the same time writing this kinky sex comic. And I mean, that's all masquerading as a superhero comic, but let's all be honest, she's tying people up with lassos regularly. We know what's happening here. I'm a little confused where the connection here is.
So what Marston, like ancient and medieval scientists before him, were doing, what he was studying was the effect that emotion has on the body. So his wife, research partner, one of his two partners, and Wonder Woman inspiration, Elizabeth Marston, happened to be working with him on experiments that were measuring systolic blood pressure while suspects were asked certain questions. So systolic blood pressure is the force that your heart exerts on your arteries when it beats. The pressure is the force of the blood pushing on the walls of your arteries. So if you have hypertension or high blood pressure, what that means is that the force pushing against your arteries is too high. Your heart is working too hard to pump blood. Over time, your heart and your circulatory system can be damaged by that extra work and pressure, which is why when you go to the doctor, they always make sure to measure your blood pressure. It's also why if you're like me and you get nervous at the doctor, your blood pressure is going to be higher because heightened emotion can raise that blood pressure.
Okay, makes sense. Fun fact, last time we went to the vet, they told us they thought our cat might actually have high blood pressure. It turns out he's just a very nervous boy, and we pet him for a little bit. He calmed down, and he was okay.
Yes, our cat was doing an excellent job of demonstrating strong emotion while having his blood pressure monitored. So Elizabeth points out to her husband that when she's excited or angry, her blood pressure is rising, and they can measure using this tool that they have in their office that this is happening. So the Marstons make this connection between systolic blood pressure and emotion. And then they start running some experiments to see what they can do with that, starting with this basic understanding. Where can you get from there? And one of the tests that they run is having subjects in the lab lie to them. So this is, in some ways, probably not the most stressful situation that a suspect could be under, because they're not a suspect. They're just, other grad students who are having kind of a weird day at the lab. But they do notice that people's blood pressure tends to rise when they are telling a lie. So this is the connection that they make. This is their contribution to the lie detector test. It is a different scientist, John Augustus Larson, who decides to go ahead and use this information in a criminal investigation. Fun fact, his wife is also weirdly going to get mixed up in its history. So, let me set the scene here. Residents of a women's-only UC Berkeley dorm called College Hall start reporting a series of thefts in 1921. Police try to crack this case, but they find out that a dorm full of college students will, under investigation, immediately start spreading rumors, accusing each other, lying to the police. It's a whole mess.
College students, what are you going to do?
So this case gets given to John Larson. He is working for the cops while he is also studying medicine and physiology. Larson is not very good at what you might consider typical cop stuff, like driving cars without crashing them, and working with his colleagues without getting into arguments that escalate into wrestling matches. Bit of a loose cannon.
That seems like perfectly normal office behavior to me.
But because he is himself a medical student, he has just read William Moulton Marsden's paper on his new test using blood pressure measuring to determine whether someone is lying. So, This inspires Larson so much that he decides to make his own blood pressure monitoring device out of tubes, charcoal paper, and a wooden board. So he has had the chance to test this out on a few other students just, around his own lab. But this dorm full of students who are accusing each other of theft are his first chance to roll out this device in real time, in a real situation, in a real criminal investigation. So he names this the cardio-pneumono-psychograph, and he takes it out to College Hall to start strapping women into it.
This is just a weird kink thing at this point.
Well, the thing about Larson is that he works for a man named August Vollmer. August Vollmer is actually big on the work of someone else we've covered, Eugene Francois Vidocq, who is often credited with bringing a more scientific approach to policing. Vollmer wants to be the next Vidocq. So he is all in on testing experimental devices on suspects. He really wants to create the next scientific breakthrough in policing in his own department. So as a test subject who could function as a control, Larson starts with a woman named Margaret Taylor. She is actually one of the victims of this thief. She has had a $400 ring stolen. She's cooperating with authorities. She's very unlikely to be the criminal and thus makes sense as a control. Larson then goes on testing dormitory residents until Helen Graham, who is an older student with a fondness for drink, displays increased readings while responding no to the question, "Did you take Miss Taylor's ring?" Graham actually ends up ripping this weird device off of her and storming out of the test. And then the next day, she shows up to the police station to complain and go, "What, you guys put me in this weird device and asked me questions and refused to accept my answers? What is going on here?" And at this point, Larson and another cop interrogate her for 12 hours until she starts crying and admits that it's possible that she could have taken the items without knowing about it while she's asleep. So 12 hours of interrogation, and the best crack that they can come up with was maybe I was sleepwalking.
Yeah, I wouldn't call that a slam dunk.
Yeah, this is not actually a clear confession for legal purposes. And Graham ends up repeatedly showing up at the station, demanding to talk to the cops and clear up this extremely weird shit that has happened to her. But after another interview that goes very deep into her trauma history and involves some very frightening threats on the cops' part, she cracks again and admits that she did take Miss Taylor's ring. In the eyes of the police, this experiment is a wild success. The machine told them exactly who they needed to grill in order to get a confession. For poor Miss Graham, this is a blow that she never recovers from. She's never actually prosecuted for theft, but she does drop out of college, return to her parents' farm. She does write Larson a letter saying that she was innocent, that she'd been tricked into confessing. For the rest of her life, she maintained that she was innocent. So the very first criminal that the lie detector test ever pointed to, even though she was never prosecuted, so she's never technically a criminal, she continued to maintain that it was wrong and she was innocent.
I mean, I'm starting to get the impression this might not be the most reliable thing on the planet, because you don't really have much, yeah.
Well, that's going to be bad news for Larson's relationship, because the next thing he does after cracking this case is he goes on and straps Miss Margaret Taylor back into his cardio-pneumono-psychograph testing machine, asks her if she loves him. When she said no, he didn't believe her because the test said that she was lying.
I mean, that's very problematic on a lot of different levels.
Romance in the 1920s. They got married 16 months later. We know that story because it was published in their wedding announcement.
I guess I'm 100 years late, but girl, are you okay?
Yeah, man, you never interrogate me to prove my love.
You know what? I have no idea how to respond to this.
Romance is truly dead.
My ghast is flabbered.
We gotta talk about an even weirder guy. Larson and Marston are not even the weirdest guys we're gonna talk about today.
All right, what do you got?
So, the College Hall case was just an investigation, one that never got all the way to prosecution. It isn't until 1935 that the polygraph test ends up getting used as evidence in court. And that is thanks to a man named Leonard Keeler, who is an amateur magician. He starts off as a high school student working for the police department, at which he went by the nickname Nard. So, young Nard works as an assistant to Larson and Vollmer in high school, and he starts tinkering with his own version of the boss's machine. And he rebrands it a bit. He calls his version the emotograph. Version 1.0 gets destroyed in a fire, but Keeler persists. So his device is combining already existing techniques of taking measurements of a person's breathing, blood pressure, and sweat. So all of these things already exist. He's not inventing the methods of measuring this, but he's combining them into one machine. So in 1933, he gets the opportunity to show off his device at the World's Fair police exhibit. And this is a bit of a party trick for the crowds, and it does impress some visitors. So in 1935, a judge who had been to the World's Fair and seen the device brings Keeler in as an expert to interview two suspects in an assault case. So Keeler interviews the suspects, and he gets his reading saying that the suspects are lying. On the stand, Keeler tells the court that he wouldn't suggest convicting solely on the results of the test. But after the jury finds the two suspects guilty, partially based on the evidence from the test, Keeler tells reporters, quote, "It means the findings of the lie detector test are as acceptable in court as fingerprint testimony," end quote. That's a strong statement.
Yeah, that's I don't know. I don't know if I would. I mean, I guess they took it, so he's technically right.
So with a little rebranding, the emotograph becomes the polygraph. And this is because Nard is named after Leonardo da Vinci, who was a polymath. So that is what the name polygraph comes from.
Wow, that's yeah. I'm disappointed they couldn't think of a more pretentious name for it.
So Keeler goes on to create the Keeler Institute, becoming a private polygraph consultant and training students on the use of the machine. So what he does is basically he invents this, he creates a school for training people in it, and he goes on to basically publicize his invention and try to get more and more court systems to use it. And the results of his efforts are that the polygraph test actually does not go on to become admissible evidence in that many criminal cases. Because over a decade before Keeler submitted those test results as evidence, the Circuit Court for the District of Columbia held in the case Fry v. United States in 1923 that polygraphic evidence is not scientifically recognized and is not generally admissible at trial. So when Keeler starts his institute for training students, the Supreme Court of the United States is already saying this is not admissible evidence at trial.
Justifiably so.
To this day, less than half of all U.S. states allow polygraph tests as evidence in a criminal trial at all. And the ones that do, their laws often come with caveats about not only using a polygraph test to determine guilt. So just because a criminal has failed a polygraph test, they cannot be held guilty in a court of law. There has to be other evidence. Because while your blood pressure might rise while you're lying, there are a lot of other things that can make your blood pressure rise and that can make you sweat or breathe faster.
You mean like maybe being stressed out if you're being accused of a crime and being interrogated by police officers?
Yeah, it turns out that that is a situation that can produce some pretty heightened emotions. And even if you are not yourself the one who is being put on trial, sometimes witnesses do also go through polygraph tests. Being asked to recount a traumatic experience in front of a police officer, one who may be asking you some very difficult questions about a very difficult time in your life, that can produce some pretty strong emotions as well.
Yeah, I mean, it kind of seems like this is just a like how upset are you right now detector which I don't know. I'm sure there are some great uses for that you could cook up, but doesn't really line up with the same as, or it doesn't really line up with "Are you telling the truth?"
Keeler himself actually understood that the true value of a polygraph test is how flustered it could make people. So his favorite technique was to leave a suspect in the cell overnight. Then he would administer the test in the morning after they had had all sleepless night just stewing in their own guilt. He even privately referred to his machine as the sweat box, not just because it measured sweat, but because it was supposed to make people sweat until they cracked under pressure and confessed. So he's not actually using this as a method of gathering evidence that can be used in a court of law. He is using this as a way to frighten suspects so much that they will crack and confess. And then the confession is what's admissible evidence.
This is just like, we're basically come back around to the divine intervention approach. I mean, there's a really good, like, somewhat up its own ass sort of like post-structuralist paper about how we've come back around to the exact same models but replaced science as our new religion.
Yes, you have reached exactly the conclusion that I was trying to lead you to. The logic behind the polygraph test has a really distressing amount of similarity with the logic behind trial by ordeal. And there's a reason why trial by ordeal got phased out of almost every legal system on Earth.
I don't know. I think it also opens up the argument that we should just bring back trial by ordeal because it has the same level of scientific backing.
Larson himself, who is one of the fathers of the polygraph test, actually started to doubt his device's accuracy after further testing. He found that about 40% of the time, the polygraph returns inconclusive results, which is not a great failure rate for the device that Vollmer and Keeler were talking up as so reliable that it could one day do away with juries.
Slightly less than half the time it works every time. Or no, slightly more than half.
So polygraph tests, they have some problems. They have a whole lot of problems, but they are still used to interrogate suspects and witnesses. Like I said, just because the results of the polygraph test themselves aren't admissible in court doesn't mean that everything that happens during that interrogation is going to get thrown away as evidence. They're also used in other government procedures, like screening candidates for law enforcement. A ton of people who are law enforcement officers themselves have gone through polygraph tests, and they believe that they work because they have gone through them.
Yeah, I mean, that definitely sounds like a weird political thing where no one's going to want to argue to lower the standards for law enforcement, even though that's not really what's happening. Mm-hmm. And so it just keeps happening and then becomes kind of legitimate because of that.
There even have been one particular weird thing I was reading about back in the days when being polygraph tested for certain federal positions meant being questioned about your sexuality. Some people, despite having an opposite sex partner, flunked their polygraph tests because they got kind of nervous about that line of questioning.
I mean, I'm really coming back around to Team Chicken entrails right now.
So all of this cultural background has led to a very popular misconception that refusing to take a polygraph test is itself evidence that someone is lying. Because who would refuse to take a polygraph test except for anyone who understands how polygraph tests work, anyone who might feel like the police are going down the wrong line of inquiry, questioning them at all, anyone who is feeling kind of stressed out and feeling like the test might not work so well on them. There are a lot of reasons why someone who is innocent or someone who is not withholding information deliberately might not take a polygraph test. Refusing a polygraph test is not evidence of anything.
On the other hand, using the phrase, if you have nothing to hide, you have nothing to fear, is evidence that you are a moron.
So that is me on my soapbox about lie detector tests. As far as I'm aware, there is no foolproof method for detecting a lie during an interrogation. whether you resort to science, God, drugs, or thumbscrews. This episode's already running long, so I didn't want to get too far into other questionable science that's not actually admissible in court either, like body language analysis, blink rate measurement, all that stuff. Believe me, I could go on about that. There's some very dubious science happening there as well. But as far as I'm aware, no one's really trying to argue this guy leaned to the left, therefore he's guilty in court. They're usually looking for something a little more substantial than that.
I mean, I think, maybe a good note to end on here. This is a personally held conviction, at least, that I have about American culture. And I am speaking mostly to an American perspective here right now, because that's the one I'm most familiar with. I find in this country, we really tend to like treating science as though it's kind of magical, and that science will help us determine, like, oh, there's one correct way to interrogate someone or determine whether they're telling the truth or not. And you just have to figure that out, and it becomes this sort of like, this kind of replicable pattern that's very, very easy. And there's kind of a fear of ambiguity and accepting the fact that you can't always rely on just an easily like demonstrable technique that's packaged into straightforward steps. And it kind of seems like the reason lie detectors have held on to this kind of cultural cachet is they fit that model. Oh, it's just a science, and we figured the science out.
So, knowing that we operate in an ambiguous and imperfect system, how can our justice system determine who is lying? And there actually are a few methods that are, again, imperfect, but better than nothing. Number one, character witnesses. Pretty obvious reasons why a character witness might themselves lie, but this is a very ancient method of trying to figure out if someone seems trustworthy. If you can collect enough people who say, I know this guy, he's on the up and up, he is not someone who would lie in court, that is an option for trying to establish whether someone is telling the truth. There are, of course, laws that penalize perjury to discourage lying in court. So you can make the consequence for lying a little bit higher. There's also collecting physical evidence like fingerprints, DNA testing, etc. Those methods are not 100% perfect. I may do an episode sometime on the history of stuff like fingerprint analysis, but they are an attempt to get a little bit closer to the objective truth of what happened in a situation.
Dimitri, are you telling me that in a messy and complicated world where absolute truth is difficult to determine, our best options are putting multiple sources in conversation with each other and reading them skeptically and engaging with them critically?
Well, sir, it's funny that you should bring that up, because I wanted to end on the probably most used method of lie detection in our court system, and the one that remains, while not 100% reliable, something that is the foundation of our legal system, which is cross-examination. So letting the other side interview a witness in court gives your opponent a chance to poke holes in their testimony and uncover a lie. It is the closest thing that we really have to a method of lie detection in our court system.
I'm thinking trial by combat sounds way better. So, if any of you fabulous listeners want to challenge us to single combat to determine the truth, where can they find us?
You can find us at facingbackward.com.
We also have a Tumblr, tumblr.com/blog/facingbackward.
And we are on Blue Sky. We're Facing Backward on Blue Sky. And I might post some pictures of Isaac eating his first Kinder Egg in defiance of the law.
I don't want to be marked forever as a criminal. Someone might try to put a polygraph on me to see if I actually ate that Kinder Egg. And if you want to support the network and all the crazy things we do, all the smuggling of candied goods from foreign countries, you can join at patreon.com/facingbackward and become one of our wonderful patrons. And as always, a special shout out to those of you who've donated at the shout out tier. You are Jan Leonard, Stephen Elkins, Martin Oliveira, Clark Canning, Ian Kellett, Matt Haynes, Jackie Frostocker, Monkey Sack, Alayla McCulloch, Karen Murphy, Peter Wales, Robert Prine, William Arno, Jonas Brandis, Nicholas Kroll, Jerry Spinrad, Jared Stevens, Jeffrey Dwork, Stefan Hrushka, Joshua Kane, Robbie and Cat, Jacob Key, Aaron Finkbeiner, and Anonymous Anna's Hummingbird, Mark Sai, Gil, Leslie Ikuta, Trash Taste Enjoyer, Harrison Reese, Shimao Toshio's History of Japonesia podcast, A House is a Perfectly Cromulent Mascot, The Fish I Catch Are Rhodes Scholars compared to Samuel Alito, Who Remains a Schmuck, and Everything Changed When the Fire Nation Attacked.